My mother dropped me off at a remote boarding school when I was 8 years old. She promised she would pick me up for Thanksgiving. She never came back. She never visited, not a single time in 10 years. The day I graduated high school, I stood on a wooden stage and looked out at a sea of proud parents holding bouquets and cameras. I searched the crowd for a familiar face. My chair in the audience remained empty. 13 years passed in total silence. Then last Tuesday, my phone rang. My mother was on the other end, frantic, demanding $3,000 for rent, claiming she was about to be homeless. I didn't yell, I didn't argue. I just asked her one question. When she heard it, the line went dead silent for 40 seconds. Before I tell you what I asked her, please hit subscribe if this story genuinely resonates with you. Also, drop your age in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let me take you to my office overlooking the Alaskan wilderness, where that 13-year silence finally broke. My name is Claire Morgan. I am 31 years old and I live in Alaska. My office sits on a high ridge surrounded by towering Sitka spruce and a clear view of the Chugach Mountains. The air outside was 10 degrees below zero that afternoon, crisp and unforgiving. Inside my sanctuary was warm, built with cedar and floor-to-ceiling glass. I earned this view. I built my luxury ecotourism company, Northern Lights Estates, from the ground up. I survived on academic scholarships, waitressing shifts, and a refusal to fail. I created a life out of the scraps I was given. I was reviewing quarterly financial projections when my personal cell phone illuminated on the mahogany desk. A Seattle area code flashed on the screen. I answered it out of habit, expecting a vendor or a client. Instead, a voice I had not heard since I was a child filled the room. Claire, oh my God, Claire. It was Margaret, my mother. Her tone carried no warmth, no hesitation, no guilt for a decade of abandonment. It was sharp, breathless, and soaked in entitlement. Frank left me, she sobbed into the receiver. He took the truck. He emptied the checking account. The landlord handed me a 3-day eviction notice this morning. If I don't wire them $3,000 by tomorrow, I'm out on the street. You have to help me. No greeting, no apology. 13 years without a word, and she opened her mouth only to make a demand. I leaned back in my leather chair. I felt my heart rate slow down. I held the phone to my ear and watched a bald eagle circle the tree line outside my window. As a child, the sound of her voice would have sent me into a panic. I spent my entire youth terrified of her approval, waiting by the dorm room window, hoping her car would pull into the gravel driveway. Now she was just a stranger in Seattle with bad credit. "Are you listening to me?" Margaret snapped, her tears vanishing the moment she didn't get an immediate yes. "I need you to wire the money today." I picked up my ceramic mug and took a slow sip of black coffee. "What was the name of the boarding school you left me at for 10 years?" I asked. The silence that followed was heavy. It was not a brief pause. It was a staggering 40 seconds of dead air. I timed it by the digital clock on my desk. 10 seconds passed. I heard her breath hitch. 20 seconds. I heard the faint sound of city traffic in the background on her end. 30 seconds. I heard her brain scrambling, desperate to find a single detail she had never bothered to learn. She had no idea. She never read my report cards. She never signed a permission slip. She just forwarded the tuition checks that kept me safely hidden from her new life. She discarded me so she could focus entirely on her new husband and my younger half-sister Emma. Margaret stammered, her voice trembling as the reality of her failure set in. I pressed the red button on my screen. The call disconnected. I set the phone face down on the desk. A profound sense of peace washed over me. The ghost that had haunted my childhood was gone, replaced by a desperate woman who had run out of options. I turned my attention back to my laptop, ready to finalize the payroll for my 50 employees. The conflict felt resolved. 10 minutes later, the phone vibrated against the wood. The screen lit up with a text message from her number. I picked it up and read the words twice. The icy Alaskan wind suddenly howling against my office windows. "You leave me no choice. We are coming to Alaska." The words on the screen glowed against the dimming light of my office. "You leave me no choice. We are coming to Alaska." I stared at the text message. The plural pronoun caught my attention immediately. We. Margaret was not traveling alone. She was bringing her favorite daughter, Emma, and Emma's husband, Derek. They were packing their bags, marching toward a destination they knew nothing about, invading a life they had no part in building. I set the phone down and turned my chair toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sun was dipping below the Chugach Mountains, casting long, sharp shadows across the snow-covered pines. Seeing that threat on a screen triggered a vivid memory of the day the silence began. I was 8 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of Margaret's sedan. We drove for hours through winding, icy roads until we reached a sprawling brick building isolated in the wilderness. It was a boarding school for children who had run out of options, or more accurately, children whose parents wanted a clean slate. Margaret told me to grab my duffel bag from the trunk. She knelt in the gravel, fixed the collar of my jacket, and promised she would be back to pick me up for Thanksgiving. She told me to be a good girl and not to cause any trouble for the headmaster. Then she got back into her car, put it in drive, and pulled away. I stood on the frozen dirt and watched her tail lights disappear around the bend. I waited by the window every day that November. Thanksgiving came and went, then Christmas, then my 9th birthday. The silence stretched into a decade. Margaret discarded me so she could focus her time, energy, and finances on her new husband and their new baby, Emma. Emma was the golden child, raised in a warm house in Seattle, handed everything she ever desired, shielded from the harsh realities of the world. I was the secret Margaret left in the snow. That isolation reached its peak on a Tuesday evening in late May, my high school graduation. The gymnasium smelled of floor wax and cheap floral arrangements. I sat in a row of folding chairs wearing a rented cap and gown, listening to the principal call out names. Every time a student walked across the wooden stage, a section of the bleachers erupted in cheers. Parents held up cameras, grandmothers wiped tears, siblings clapped. When my name echoed through the speakers, the silence in the room was deafening. I walked across the stage, took my diploma, and looked out at the audience. I searched the crowd for a familiar face, hoping against all logic that Margaret had finally remembered me. But my designated chair in the second row was empty. I did not cry that day. I took that empty chair and forged it into armor. If I was going to be entirely alone in the world, I decided I would be untouchable. I worked 3 jobs through my early 20s. I saved every dollar waiting tables at night and guiding wilderness tours during the day. I studied the tourism market, bought my first acre of remote land at auction, and built a single cabin with my own hands. I leveraged that cabin to build another and then another. Today, Northern Lights Estates is a premier ecotourism destination catering to the wealthiest clients in the world. I own 500 acres of pristine Alaskan wilderness, a private helicopter pad, and a grand lodge that generates millions in revenue. I transformed the wilderness that was supposed to be my prison into my kingdom. My phone vibrated again, pulling me back to the warmth of my office. I looked at the text message once more. The math didn't add up. Margaret had called me less than an hour ago, frantic, claiming she was facing imminent eviction. She demanded $3,000 to keep a roof over her head. Yet her text declared she was boarding a flight with Emma and Derek. Same day, last-minute airline tickets from Seattle to Anchorage are incredibly expensive. Purchasing 3 one-way fares would easily cost upwards of $3,500. A woman weeping over a 3-day eviction notice does not possess the capital for premium air travel. Someone funded this invasion. I opened my contacts and scrolled down to the only family member who ever sent me a birthday card, my grandmother Helen. She lived in a modest retirement community in Spokane, relying entirely on a fixed monthly pension. She had a soft heart and a trusting nature, too, traits Margaret exploited frequently. I tapped her name and put the phone on speaker. It rang twice before her frail, familiar voice answered. "Oh, Claire, sweetheart. Oh, I'm just so happy to hear your voice." Her tone was bright, filled with a sudden artificial hope. It made my stomach turn. "Hi, Nana," I said, keeping my voice steady and warm. "How are you doing today?" "I'm just overjoyed, honey. Margaret called me a few hours ago. She told me the wonderful news. I've been crying happy tears all afternoon." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany desk. "What news did she share with you, Nana?" Helen let out a soft, relieved sigh. "She said you called her. She said you were weeping, begging her to forgive the past and asking her to come visit you so you could finally heal the family. She said you wanted to reconcile with her and Emma, but you couldn't afford to fly them up to Alaska." The sheer magnitude of the lie hung in the air. Margaret didn't just twist the truth. She fabricated an entire emotional reality to manipulate an 80-year-old woman. "Is that right?" I murmured, staring at the grain of the wood on my desk. "Yes, dear. She said it was an emergency, that you needed your mother right now. I know my pension is tight, but family is family." I went down to the bank and wired her $3,500 so she could buy the tickets for her, Emma, and Derek. "I'm just so proud of you for taking the first step to fix things, Claire." A cold fury settled into my bones. Margaret didn't just abandon me as a child. She weaponized my trauma, using my imagined tears to rob her own mother. She drained an elderly woman's savings account to fund a parasitic vacation under the guise of maternal healing. I didn't correct Helen. I didn't want to break her heart or humiliate her by revealing that her own daughter had conned her out of her living expenses. I would handle Margaret myself. I would make sure Helen's money was returned with interest. "Thank you, Nana," I said softly. "I love you. I'll talk to you soon." "I love you too, sweetheart. Have a beautiful reunion." I ended the call. The last trace of biological obligation evaporated from my conscience. They were not a family-seeking connection. They were a financial cartel looking for a new mark. I turned to my computer monitor and opened an aviation tracking website. I typed in the origin and destination. A digital map filled the screen, displaying a small white airplane icon crawling steadily across the Gulf of Alaska. Flight 492. It was currently cruising at 36,000 feet, carrying 3 passengers who believed they had outsmarted everyone. They expected to land in Anchorage and find the broken, desperate girl they threw away 23 years ago. They expected a soft target. They assumed I was living paycheck to paycheck in some frozen, desolate shack ripe for their exploitation. They intended to barge into my life, assert their dominance, and leech off my resources. I watched the altitude numbers on the screen begin to tick down. The plane was starting its descent. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the coat rack. I pulled down my heavy winter parka. If they wanted to play a game of deception, I would set the board. I would not block them at the airport. I would not flaunt my wealth or my security team. I would give them exactly what they expected to find. I would feed their arrogance, let them settle into their entitlement, and give them enough rope to tie their own knot. I picked up my keys, walked out of my luxury office, and headed toward the employee parking lot. I had a flight to catch. The Anchorage International Airport arrival curb is a chaotic stretch of concrete. I parked my vehicle in the loading zone and left the engine running. I didn't drive my customary Range Rover. Instead, I brought a 2010 Subaru Outback, a vehicle that served as a snowplow and utility hauler for my ground maintenance crew. The exterior paint was chipped. The rear bumper bore a prominent dent from a misjudged snowbank, and the interior smelled faintly of wet pine needles and industrial floor cleaner. It was the perfect stage prop. I stood by the front fender, letting the biting wind whip my hair around my face. I wore a faded flannel shirt and an older, scuffed insulated jacket. The sliding glass doors parted. 3 figures stepped out into the freezing Alaskan evening. Margaret led the group. She wore a pristine white faux fur coat, looking like a woman expecting a red carpet rather than a frozen tundra. Behind her walked Emma, my younger half-sister. Emma dragged a designer suitcase with a broken wheel, her face pinched in discomfort. She wore thin leather boots entirely unsuited for the ice beneath her feet. Beside Emma stood Derek, her husband. He wore a fitted designer tracksuit and held a premium coffee cup, making no effort to help his wife with her struggling luggage. Margaret spotted me. Her eyes swept over my faded jacket, darted to the rusted wheel wells of the Subaru, and settled into a look of profound pity. That single expression told me everything. She believed she had flown into a rescue mission where she would hold all the cards. She walked toward me with her arms outstretched. She wrapped me in a stiff, perfumed embrace. "Oh," Margaret sighed, stepping back to inspect my face. "You look so tired, sweetheart, and this cold. How do you live in this misery?" "It builds character," I replied smoothly, keeping my tone soft and submissive. "Let me help you with your bags." Emma shoved her suitcase toward me without a word of greeting. "Watch the zippers. They cost more than that car," she muttered, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. "Is the heater even working in that junk heap?" "It takes a few minutes to warm up," I said, lifting the heavy luggage into the trunk next to a pair of muddy jumper cables. "I'm sorry it's not fancier. Money has been tight lately." Margaret exchanged a knowing glance with Emma. It was a look of smug validation. They wanted me to be destitute. My poverty justified Margaret leaving me. If I was a failure, her abandonment was just a tragic circumstance, not a moral failing. Derek finally spoke, gesturing toward the back seat with his coffee cup. "You expect all of us to fit in there? I have bad knees. I need leg room." "It's only a 2-hour drive," I offered meekly, closing the trunk. "I'll drive carefully." The journey out of Anchorage and into the deep wilderness provided ample opportunity for them to reveal their true nature. The heater in the Subaru rattled loudly, blowing lukewarm air into the cabin. Emma complained endlessly from the back seat. She criticized the lack of cellular service, the rough suspension, and the smell of the upholstery. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, offering thinly veiled insults disguised as maternal advice. "You know, Claire," Margaret said, adjusting her designer sunglasses despite the setting sun, "Seattle has so many opportunities. You don't have to struggle out here in the middle of nowhere. I'm sure Derek could find you an entry-level position at his firm. You could answer phones. It's honest work." Derek snorted from the back. "She'd need to update her wardrobe first." "No offense, Claire, but you look like a lumberjack." "None taken," I replied softly, gripping the steering wheel. I filed every word away, every insult, every slight. every arrogant assumption. I let them build their false reality. Emma kicked the back of my seat. We need to stop for groceries. I'm starving. I only eat organic. And Derek needs his specific protein shakes. You're paying, right? Since you dragged us all the way up here for this reunion. I have some basics waiting for you, I said, evading the demand. I stretched my budget to get you some nice things. Emma scoffed. Basics? Great. I hope you at least have decent Wi-Fi. We turned off the main highway onto a secluded, unpaved logging road. The Subaru bumped over deep ruts and snowdrifts. After 10 minutes of navigating through dense spruce trees, we arrived at our destination. It was a small, rustic staff cabin situated on the outermost edge of my property. Modest and isolated, it lacked every luxury my family expected. I parked the car and turned off the engine. The silence of the forest immediately surrounded us. We're here, I announced. Margaret stared through the windshield, her jaw dropping slightly. Here? You live here? It's modest, I said, opening my door, but it keeps the wind out. Derek stepped out into the snow, looking around in disgust. There's no paved driveway. Where's the nearest store? How do we order food? There's no delivery out here, I explained, carrying their bags onto the porch. You have to cook your own meals. The stove is wood burning, but I left you plenty of kindling. Emma stood near the bumper, refusing to walk in the snow. A wood-burning stove? Are you kidding me? What kind of savage lifestyle is this? I need room service. I need a hot shower. You expect me to chop wood? I'm sorry, I said, lowering my gaze to the floorboards. I truly am. This is the best I can offer right now. I thought you wanted to see my life. I thought you wanted to be a family. Margaret stepped onto the porch, waving a dismissive hand. We do, sweetheart, but we're accustomed to a certain standard of living. It's just quite a shock to see how far you've fallen. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and pushed it open. The interior was clean but incredibly basic. A small kitchenette, a single bathroom with a temperamental water heater, and a lofted sleeping area. No television, no internet router, just the quiet isolation of the Alaskan woods. Settle in, I told them, leaving the keys on a small wooden table. I have to head back to work for a few hours. I'll check on you tomorrow. Emma crossed her arms, shivering in the center of the room. You're leaving us here in this shack? What are we supposed to do for entertainment? There are some board games in the cupboard, I suggested softly. I backed out the door before they could formulate another demand. I walked down the steps and returned to the rusted Subaru. I started the engine, shifting the car into drive. I looked in the rearview mirror. Margaret was staring out the cabin window, her face contorted in a mix of horror and profound disappointment. They believed they had won. They believed they had established dominance over a weak, impoverished relative. They had no idea they were standing on a tiny, isolated sliver of my kingdom. I drove back down the unpaved logging road until the staff cabin disappeared behind the dense tree line. Once I hit the private security gate, I pressed a button on my sun visor. The heavy iron bars swung open, granting me access to the restricted inner grounds of Northern Lights Estates. The rough dirt path transitioned into smooth, heated asphalt that melted the falling snow on contact. I drove just over the high ridge, leaving the illusion of poverty far behind me. The landscape opened up to reveal my actual residence. My home was a breathtaking $4 million architectural masterpiece, constructed from imported timber and floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass. Warm, golden light spilled from the expansive living room out onto the pristine snow. A private heated driveway curved toward a 4-car garage where my actual vehicles rested. I parked the old Subaru near the maintenance shed and walked up the illuminated stone pathway to my front door. The biometric scanner read my fingerprint, unlocking the custom oak entrance. I stepped inside. The air was perfectly climate controlled. The faint scent of cedar and expensive vanilla filled the grand foyer. I took off my faded jacket and hung it in the closet, shedding the character of the struggling sister. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the marble kitchen island and walked over to my expansive living room windows. I looked out over the dark expanse of my property. Somewhere out there in the freezing woods, my mother and her golden family were huddling around a cold stove, plotting how to exploit a woman who didn't exist. I took a slow, deliberate sip from my glass. The trap was set. Now I just needed to let them spring it. I didn't visit the cabin again. I let them marinate in their discomfort, their arrogance slowly rotting into desperation. Instead, I monitored them through the security cameras I had discreetly installed in the staff quarters months ago. Standard protocol for all remote properties to ensure guest safety. From my warm office, I watched Derek refuse to chop firewood, opting instead to complain about the cold. I watched Emma rummage through every drawer and cabinet, searching for valuables that didn't exist. And then I watched her find it. The black leather portfolio I had deliberately left on the dining table. She grabbed it, unzipped the binding, and began flipping through the pages. Her lips moved as she read the maintenance schedules and vendor contracts. A smirk crept across her features. "She's just a glorified janitor," Emma announced to the room, tossing a page onto the table. "Look at this. She doesn't even own anything. She's just a property manager for that big resort up the road. She coordinates snow plows and orders toilet paper." Derek walked over, leaning over her shoulder. Margaret watched from the sofa, shaking her head in profound disappointment. They felt vindicated. My supposed lowly status cured their bruised egos. Then Emma's fingers found the interior pocket. She pulled out the silver corporate card. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. Emma stared at the embossed numbers, tracing the Northern Lights Estates logo with her thumb. "What is that?" Derek asked, his eyes widening. "It's an expense card," Emma said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It has her name on it, but it belongs to the resort. It's corporate money." "Put that back, Emma," Margaret said, weakly from the couch. It was a performative objection. Her tone lacked any real authority or moral conviction. She was pretending to be a responsible parent while secretly hoping her daughter would secure a prize. "Are you kidding?" Emma scoffed, slipping the silver card into the back pocket of her designer jeans. "She dragged us to this frozen hellhole. She forced us to sleep on lumpy mattresses and eat instant oatmeal. She owes us for being such a terrible sister. Besides, the resort pays the bill. Corporate entities write this stuff off all the time. They won't even notice." Derek grinned, clapping his hands together. "We deserve a real vacation. Let's get out of this shack." Emma rationalized grand theft within 30 seconds. She didn't view it as a crime. She viewed it as a belated inheritance. She felt entitled to compensation for the mere inconvenience of existing in a space that didn't cater to her luxury standards. I sat in the glow of the security monitors. My heart rate did not elevate. My hands remained steady on the console keyboard. I watched my half-sister steal my financial property with zero hesitation. The trap was no longer just set. The prey had stepped directly onto the pressure plate. The evening of the annual Winter Charity Gala arrived with pristine timing. The event was held in the grand ballroom of a historic lodge in the neighboring township. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting fractured light across polished oak floors. Northern Lights Estates was the primary sponsor. I funded the catered salmon, the ice sculptures, and the rental of the entire venue. My biological relatives knew none of this. They simply knew a high society party was happening, and they wanted access. I had sent them 3 VIP passes, along with a deliberately planted memo suggesting Emma was being considered for a 6-figure marketing position. The bait was irresistible. I stood near the grand fireplace at the far end of the hall, engaged in conversation with Thomas, a prominent venture capitalist and the regional director of the Wildlife Conservation Board. My custom emerald silk gown draped perfectly against the floor. The diamond necklace resting against my collarbone caught the ambient light with every subtle movement. Through the reflection in a gilded mirror above the mantel, I watched them arrive. Margaret, Emma, and Derek stepped out of the rusted Subaru, now looking absurdly out of place among the fleet of luxury vehicles lining the circular driveway. They wore their finest attempt at elegance, Margaret in a sequined dress a decade out of fashion, Emma in a tight metallic cocktail dress, Derek in a shiny, ill-fitting suit. They looked exactly like people trying desperately to fake a status they had never earned. They pushed through the entrance and gravitated instantly toward the open bar. Derek leaned heavily against the mahogany counter, demanding top-shelf whiskey. Emma ordered a complicated martini. Margaret stood between them, her eyes scanning the room with practiced precision, searching for a wealthy benefactor. From my vantage point, I observed Emma's gaze sweep across the ballroom and land on my silhouette. She stared at the back of my emerald dress, her expression souring into visible envy. She admired the cut of the silk and the effortless posture of the woman wearing it, possessing zero comprehension that she was coveting the sister she had spent the entire weekend degrading. The ambient music faded. The event organizer stepped up to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight we gather to celebrate the preservation of our pristine wilderness. But this event would not be possible without the unparalleled generosity of our primary benefactor." Margaret pushed her way to the front, positioning herself for the introduction of the mysterious billionaire she planned to exploit. This individual built a legacy of sustainability, resilience, and unyielding strength, the organizer continued. She transformed a vision into an empire that supports our entire community. The main chandelier dimmed. A brilliant white spotlight ignited from the balcony overhead. It swept across the polished floor, passing over the bar, bypassing Margaret entirely. The beam of light settled firmly on me. I turned away from the mirror. I faced the crowd, holding my head high, stepping directly into the brilliant illumination. Please welcome our visionary CEO and founder of Northern Lights Estates, Claire Morgan. The color drained entirely from Margaret's face. Her jaw parted, leaving her mouth hanging open in silent shock. Beside her, Emma lost all motor function. Her fingers went slack. The crystal martini glass slipped from her grasp, striking the marble floor with a sharp crack, shattering into hundreds of glittering shards. They stood frozen, staring at the woman they had spent 48 hours mocking, belittling, and attempting to exploit. I walked slowly down the center aisle toward the podium. The crowd parted respectfully. State senators nodded in my direction. Local business owners offered warm smiles of recognition. I ascended the short staircase and stepped behind the microphone. "Thank you," I began, my voice carrying clear and steady through the sound system. Alaska is an unforgiving frontier. It tests our endurance. It challenges our limits, but it also offers a profound truth. I paused, letting the words settle over the silent room. In this harsh environment, you cannot survive on empty promises. You cannot endure the winter by relying on the labor of others while contributing nothing yourself. I directed my gaze straight toward the back of the hall. When I first arrived in this territory, I had nothing, I continued. I learned very quickly that true warmth is not handed to you. You must build the shelter. You must chop the wood. You must lay the foundation with your own hands. I thought about the decade I spent waiting by the window while Margaret lived in a heated Seattle townhouse. There are those who believe the world owes them comfort, I said, my tone sharpening. They view the success of others not as inspiration, but as an unfair distribution of wealth. They arrive with empty hands and demanding voices, expecting to harvest fields they never planted. But tonight, we celebrate the builders. We honor the individuals who understand that true legacy is earned, never demanded. The applause started before I even finished the final sentence. It swelled into a thunderous ovation. I offered a single graceful nod to the audience, stepped away from the podium, and walked toward the private VIP section. It took less than 2 minutes for the storm to arrive. Margaret, Emma, and Derek shoved their way through the applauding crowd. They ducked under the velvet rope, their faces flushed with frantic energy. Margaret breached my personal space first, her faux fur coat slipping off one shoulder. "You hid this from us," Margaret hissed. "You let us sleep in that freezing shack. You let us eat instant food. You intentionally humiliated your own mother while you sit here wearing diamonds. Why did you hide your wealth from us?" She didn't ask how I achieved success. She didn't express a single ounce of maternal pride. Her only concern was delayed access to my financial resources. "I didn't hide anything," I replied softly. "I simply matched the exact level of effort and care you provided me for the last 23 years. I gave you a roof. I gave you food. It's far more than you ever gave me." Margaret's eyes narrowed into dark, hateful slits. "I gave you life," Margaret declared, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "Everything you have built exists because of me. You owe me compensation. I'm entitled to half of this company." Before I could respond, Emma pushed past her mother. "You set us up," Emma screamed. "You tricked us. You played a sick psychological game. You owe me $1 million for this deception. I'm not leaving the state until you wire the funds." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice to match her. Hysteria. I raised my right hand and offered a subtle gesture to the shadows. 2 men stepped forward, towering security professionals in tailored suits. They moved with silent efficiency, forming a solid wall between my family and myself. Margaret gasped, stumbling backward. Emma froze, her threats dying in her throat. "You don't get to make demands on my property," I said calmly. I reached into my designer evening clutch. I pulled out my tablet. "You want to discuss what is owed?" I whispered. "Let's review the accounting." I tapped the screen, opening the encrypted folder. "You demand a share of this empire based on maternal devotion," I stated. "Let's examine the official record." I turned the screen outward, displaying a digitized ledger bearing the seal of the Cascade Mountain Academy. "The institution where you left me maintained strict administrative protocols," I explained. "They logged every piece of incoming mail, every phone call, every visitor." I pointed to the blank spaces beside my name. 10 years, 3,650 days, 0 visits, 0 phone calls, 0 letters. You didn't even send signature authorization when my lungs failed and I was hospitalized with pneumonia. Margaret's victim narrative crumbled. I tapped the screen again. The device paired with the sound system. Static crackled through the overhead speakers, followed by Derek's voice. "We stay right here. She'll have to bring us food and firewood. We live for free until spring, and there's nothing she can do to stop us." Emma's distinct laughter filled the air. "Claire's just a low-level employee. The accounting department will assume it's legitimate. If they audit and find out, they'll fire her, not us. She'll take the fall, and we get the luxury vacation we deserve." I paused the recording. The atmosphere shifted. The brief flicker of sympathy from onlookers hardened into disgust. You didn't come seeking a family reunion, I said. You came to execute a hostile takeover. I shifted my focus to Emma. I rotated the tablet toward her, displaying the Aurora Estates Premium Wellness Authorization slip with her forged signature. $4,385, I read aloud. You charged a glacial mud wrap, hot stone massage, private helicopter charter, and 2 bottles of vintage champagne to a corporate account you stole from my desk. Emma swallowed hard, raising her chin in desperate bluff. It's a corporate write-off. Your boss has insurance. That's the core of your miscalculation, I replied, my voice dropping to a cooler register. I am not a mid-level manager. I gestured to the ballroom around us. I own the desk you stole the card from. I own the lodge where you drank the champagne. I own the helicopter that flew you over the glaciers. You committed felony wire fraud and identity theft against a multi-million-dollar corporate entity. A figure stepped forward from the crowd, Sheriff Daniels, the chief law enforcement officer for the municipality. He walked toward Emma with slow, measured steps. "Ma'am," he commanded, "hand over the silver expense card." Emma reached behind her with shaking fingers. She retrieved the card and dropped it into the officer's hand as if the plastic burned her skin. Sheriff Daniels reached toward his utility belt. The sharp metallic clinking of steel handcuffs broke free from the leather pouch. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Emma let out a piercing shriek. "No! It's a mistake. Mom, do something." Margaret stood paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound. Sheriff Daniels secured Emma's wrists. The ratcheting sound echoed over the soft jazz music. "You're under arrest for felony wire fraud and identity theft." Derek witnessed his wife being restrained. He realized the severe legal jeopardy surrounding them. He didn't speak. He didn't offer comfort. Derek took one step backward, then another, retreating into the shadows. He abandoned his bride, eager to create distance between himself and the wreckage. Sheriff Daniels tugged gently on the steel chain, guiding Emma toward the exit. The crowd parted. Emma kept her head down, her metallic dress shimmering under the exit signs as she walked out into the freezing night. Margaret watched her golden child succumb to law enforcement. Stripped of tactics, she resorted to the oldest theater in her repertoire. She collapsed. Her knees struck the marble floor with a heavy thud. The white faux fur coat slipped from her shoulders. She clasped her hands together, looking up at me through manufactured tears. "Please, Claire," Margaret sobbed. "I'm so sorry. We're blood. You can't do this to your own mother. Family must stick together." The phrase hung in the chilled air. I looked down at her. "I asked you a single question on the telephone last week," I said softly. "I'll give you one final opportunity to answer it." Margaret stopped sobbing, genuine terror crossing her features. "What was the name of my boarding school?" The ballroom fell into profound stillness. 10 seconds passed. Margaret opened her mouth, but no sound came. 20 seconds. Her eyes darted around, searching for a lifeline that didn't exist. 30 seconds. She squeezed her eyes shut, digging through the shallow archives of her memory. She found nothing. 40 seconds. The agonizing passage of time served as undeniable testament to her neglect. She had no idea where I spent a decade of my life. "That's what I thought," I whispered. I stepped back, turning toward the shadows. Marcus, my lead corporate attorney, stepped forward carrying a manila envelope. He stopped directly in front of Derek, pressing the envelope against his chest. "What is this?" Derek stammered. "Your formal notice of expulsion," Marcus explained. "When you signed the guest liability waiver, You legally acknowledge your status as transient short-term lodgers. Clause 4 states that any fraudulent activity terminates the lodging agreement forthwith. Since your wife just committed felony wire fraud, your invitation is permanently revoked. Margaret scrambled to her feet. You can't evict us into the snow. We have tenant rights. Marcus offered a thin smile. You surrendered your residential rights when you signed the commercial waiver. You're now classified as trespassers. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate the staff cabin. Your suitcases are currently sitting outside the main resort gate. If you remain past that deadline, you'll incur a $500 penalty for every hour you overstay, and my client will authorize Sheriff Daniels to arrest you for criminal trespassing. The legal checkmate was absolute. I raised my hand, signaling my security detail. The guards stepped forward, placing their hands on Margaret and Derek's shoulders, marching them toward the exit. Margaret tried to look back at me, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief, but the guards kept her moving forward. I watched the heavy glass doors swing shut behind them. They were gone. 6 months later. The morning light over the Chugach Mountains was brilliant and clear. I woke to my phone vibrating on the nightstand. 79 missed calls, 42 text messages, 14 voicemails. Margaret had activated the extended family network in Seattle, spinning a hysterical narrative to my aunts, uncles, and cousins. In her version, I was a tyrannical monster who lured my vulnerable family to Alaska, trapped them in a freezing cabin, framed my innocent sister, and threw my elderly mother into the snow. I didn't answer a single call. Instead, I documented everything. I took screenshots of every accusatory text, time-stamped every missed call, transcribed the voicemails. Then I switched the phone to silent and set it face down. I opened my secure laptop and contacted David, my corporate investigator. I asked him to verify Margaret's eviction story. At noon, the intelligence report arrived. There was no eviction notice filed. Margaret's rent was paid in full for the next 2 months. Frank hadn't left. His vehicle remained parked in their driveway. But David had dug deeper. He flagged a pending transaction from a maritime travel agency, a 14-day luxury Caribbean cruise departing from Miami. The required deposit to secure the reservation was exactly $3,000. She hadn't called me in desperate panic. She'd called because she wanted to secure a tropical vacation and viewed my bank account as her personal travel fund. It was time to dismantle her theater permanently. I created a new email and populated the recipient field with every extended family member who had contacted me. I left the subject line blank. In the body, I typed, "Here's the truth you're looking for." I attached 3 files. 1. The audio recording of Margaret, Emma, and Derek plotting to steal corporate funds. 2. The public booking record from the county jail detailing Emma's felony charges. 3. The intercepted travel agency invoice for the $3,000 Caribbean cruise deposit. I didn't add explanation. The evidence spoke with brutal clarity. I pressed send. The email vanished into cyberspace, carrying the payload that would shatter Margaret's victim narrative across her entire social network. I closed the laptop. The digital siege was broken. The flying monkeys were silenced. Final reflection. The fire crackled in the Riverstone hearth, casting warm golden glow across my living room. Outside, the Alaskan winter raged, but the cold couldn't penetrate the walls I had built. I sat in my favorite leather armchair, watching the people gathered around my coffee table. Thomas sat near the fire, recounting a story from his venture capital days. Sarah, my lead concierge, laughed, sharing food with her husband. Sheriff Daniels debated local zoning with familiar camaraderie. These were not my employees. They were my chosen tribe. For 23 years, I carried invisible weight, the heavy expectation of biological loyalty. I harbored quiet hope that one day my mother would look at me with pride. I poured emotional energy into a bottomless well, hoping to draw water from dry earth. Sitting by the fire, I finally understood the fundamental truth. Sharing DNA is merely an accident of biology. It doesn't generate automatic loyalty, and it certainly doesn't grant anyone a free pass to exploit your hard work. Family is not defined by birth certificates or shared last names. Family is defined by consistent action. Family is the group of people who show up when the storm hits, who respect your sanctuary, who celebrate your victories without demanding a cut. My biological relatives proved incapable of such actions. Their absence was no longer tragic loss, it was vital protection. Once I stopped grieving the family I wish I had, I found freedom to embrace the family I had actually earned. News from Seattle trickled back through reliable channels. Emma remains entangled in federal courts, facing multiple counts of wire fraud and identity theft. The legal fees drain every cent she possesses. She'll carry a felony record for the rest of her life. Derek lost his remote sales position due to erratic behavior. Without financial support, he fell behind on obligations and now faces eviction from his Seattle apartment. The tragic destiny they plotted to force upon me became their own inescapable reality. Margaret suffered the most poetic downfall. The prosecutor charged her for filing a false police report, but her true punishment occurred within her social circle. The email I sent shattered the curtain on her stage. Confronted with time-stamped proof, her flying monkeys scattered. Her siblings refused loans for legal fees. The travel agency canceled the luxury cruise, keeping the non-refundable deposit. Margaret now sits in a quiet, lonely townhouse, entirely isolated by her own deception. Meanwhile, Northern Lights Estates continues to thrive. We closed the winter season with record-breaking profits. We broke ground on a new wellness pavilion. My staff received generous bonuses. The Conservation Fund met its annual goal 3 months early. My empire flourishes because it's rooted in tangible reality, built on integrity and mutual respect rather than coercion and deceit. The contrast between our lives isn't luck. It's the direct result of choices we made. They chose to extract. I chose to build. They relied on deception. I relied on discipline. I want to speak directly to you now. If you're listening and recognize the suffocating burden of toxic obligations, if you have a parent who demands your time, money, and emotional labor while offering nothing but criticism, know this. Setting boundaries is not cruelty, it's survival. You're not required to endure abuse to prove loyalty. You're not obligated to finance poor decisions of adults who refuse accountability. You don't owe your abusers a seat at the table you built. True empowerment comes from recognizing your inherent worth and refusing to let predators discount it. I face the ghosts of my past and refuse to let them haunt my future. The peace I feel tonight, watching the fire, listening to laughter of my true friends, is worth every difficult decision. Have you ever had to enforce an unbreakable boundary with a toxic parent? Did you face the guilt, hold your ground, and walk away to protect your peace? Drop your story in the comments. Your courage might inspire someone fighting that same battle. Thank you for listening to my journey. Protect your space. Build your empire. Never apologize for choosing yourself.